I was barefoot, holding a cup of cold coffee, when my parents' SUV rolled to a stop outside my gate. My brother's 2 kids were pushed out first, confused, crying, clutching backpacks too heavy for their shoulders. Then my mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father didn't even turn off the engine. The door slammed. Tires spun. And just like that, they abandoned them on my lawn like unwanted packages. My chest burned with humiliation, rage, and a familiar truth: I was the family dumping ground. Standing there, with 2 trembling children staring up at me, I felt something dark and precise click into place. This wasn't chaos. This was war. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from, because I need to know how far this story is about to travel. They didn't even knock. Just the sound of tires grinding gravel, a door slamming, and the sudden stillness that followed. I stepped onto the porch in my sleep shirt, the ceramic mug sweating in my hand, lukewarm coffee forgotten. 2 little figures stood on the edge of my lawn, backpacks slipping off their tiny shoulders, faces streaked with dried tears and heat. My niece clutched her brother's hand like he was the last raft in an ocean. Behind them, my parents' SUV rolled forward without pause, taillights blinking like some grotesque farewell. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. My father never looked back. My mother stared forward like this was just another errand to check off. No explanation. No apology. Just abandonment, as casually cruel as blinking. For a moment, the world narrowed to that one scene. The kids trembling. My neighbor's curtains shifting as eyes peeked out. The echo of betrayal louder than the departing engine. That wasn't a decision made in the moment. It was premeditated, rehearsed, and delivered with surgical detachment. I was the designated fallback. The disposable daughter. The reliable one they could always toss their consequences onto like a pile of unpaid bills. And I just stood there, bare feet on cracked cement, skin prickling with humiliation and rage. The boy, 6, maybe 7, wiped his nose on his sleeve and looked at me like I was supposed to explain something. His sister, smaller, didn't say a word. Her eyes just followed the retreating car as though still expecting it to reverse. As though the people who had left them might come back. But I knew better. That car wasn't coming back. My hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of realization: this wasn't an accident. This was a message. This was abandonment wrapped in a favor. My parents had decided my brother's mess was mine to handle now. Like a dirty dish passed across the table. I inhaled through my teeth. "Come inside," I said. My voice was too steady, too calm. I could hear it, the rehearsed tone of someone raised to make crisis sound manageable. I held the door open, and they obeyed, stepping across the threshold like fugitives crossing into unfamiliar territory. Their backpacks thudded onto the floor with the weight of too much. Too much silence. Too much fear. Too much betrayal. Inside, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a trap that had just snapped shut. I knelt and opened the girl's bag. A half-eaten sandwich. A wrinkled sweater. A legal document. I didn't react, yet. I just stood, walked to the counter, and plugged in my phone. Missed calls. 2. Voicemail. 1. I didn't press play. I already knew the tone. I already knew the words: "We just need a little help. You're so good with them. It's only temporary." There was a text, too. From my mother. Just one sentence: "It's what's best for everyone." The kind of sentence that's been used to justify every generational trauma known to man. I stared at it. Then took a screenshot. The kid sat silently on the couch. Not crying. Not speaking. Just waiting, like people accustomed to uncertainty. I watched them. I saw pieces of my childhood in their posture, the slumped shoulders of children who already knew they were an afterthought. My brother, the golden child, the hurricane with enablers for parents, had vanished again. And they, those supposed guardians, those polished monsters, had decided I would be the cleanup crew. But I wasn't the girl they remembered. I wasn't the fixer anymore. And they'd just made the mistake of handing me the matchbook. I moved through the house with mechanical grace. I poured juice into chipped glasses. I handed out blankets. I smiled. And while I comforted with one hand, the other was documenting everything, photos of the children's belongings, timestamps, my phone log. Not out of paranoia. Out of precision. Out of the cold, new clarity that comes when you finally see what someone is willing to do to protect the wrong child. I remembered every holiday where my brother's tantrums were blamed on stress, while my tears were called dramatic. Every secret I kept for the family. Every time I swallowed anger because peace was more important than truth. They'd taught me to hold my tongue, to serve the family, to never embarrass anyone. But this was the day the scales shattered. This was the kind of betrayal that rewrites bloodlines. I kept the television on for noise, for comfort. The kids leaned into it. I sat on the floor beside them, letting the scene digest. Letting them see that I wasn't panicking. That they were safe, but not forgotten. That someone had chosen to stay, even if it wasn't the people who should have. Hours passed. No one called again. That silence, that was louder than any scream. At nightfall, I tucked them into the guest room and stared at the ceiling from the hallway. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just opened my laptop and created a new folder. I titled it Custody Manipulation. Inside it, I uploaded the photos, the text, the voicemail, the calendar entries. I wrote a statement, calm, factual. Then I emailed myself a copy. Backed it up to the cloud. I knew exactly how this would go. They'd spin it. Pretend it was an emergency. Say they were coming back. That I misunderstood. But they'd left legal documents in the kids' bags. They wanted this off their hands. They wanted to disappear and have me explain it to the world. I would. Just not the way they expected. I stood outside on the porch again, watching the street. The SUV was gone, but its trail lingered. Like a crime scene with no blood, only silence. The wind picked up. Leaves scattered across the yard where my niece had dropped her pink backpack. I didn't pick it up. I let it sit there, visible. A quiet monument to abandonment. In the distance, a phone lit up in the darkness. Unknown number. I picked it up. My mother's voice. "I hope you understand," she said. "You're the only one we could trust." I didn't answer. I ended the call. And then I hit record. There's a moment after betrayal when the hurt shifts into something sharper, something that cuts cleaner than sadness. It was early morning. The kids were still asleep, curled on the mattress like they were trying to take up less space in the world. I stood at the kitchen counter, fingers tied around a chipped mug, watching the sun bleed through the blinds. I didn't feel rage yet. Just that deep, dull ache of confirmation. Because the truth was, I wasn't shocked. Not really. What they did yesterday, abandoning my brother's children in my yard like some shameful secret, they had been building toward it for years. And I had been watching, pretending I didn't see it. I opened the drawer where I kept bills and junk mail. I dug through envelopes, receipts, until I found what I was looking for, a yellowing folder marked with my mother's neat handwriting. Inside were copies of old tuition receipts, mine and my brother's. I laid them side by side. Mine, community college, partially paid. His, private university, fully covered. I already knew, of course. But seeing it like that, ink on paper, made it undeniable. The pattern wasn't just emotional. It was financial. Strategic. They had always chosen him. And they had always expected me to make do, to pick up what he dropped and call it grace. My hands moved without thinking, clicking open old email threads, messages I had buried but never deleted. There it was, Mom's voice in typeface. "We need your help covering Eric's rent this month. Just until he gets on his feet." That was 6 years ago. He never got on his feet. He just got used to being caught. And I got used to being the net. My breath caught in my throat as I read the next one. Don't tell your father. He's already stressed. We'll pay you back next month. They never did. The last email in the thread was me, politely saying it was okay. I remember sending it. I remember crying after. Not because of the money, but because I wanted them to love me for saying yes. I thought that was how you earned it. You give until it hurts, and then they notice. But they didn't. They just took. I closed the laptop, heart pounding. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a contingency plan. The silence in the house was unbearable, so I walked outside. The pink backpack was still on the porch, just like I'd left it. I picked it up this time. Not out of care, but to see what else they'd tried to hide. The front pocket held crayons, a cracked iPad, and a folded piece of paper, a school form with my name written in under emergency guardian. My name. Not theirs. It had been printed weeks ago. Signed. Submitted. They hadn't just dumped the kids on me. They had legally arranged for it in advance. I staggered back inside, adrenaline burning under my skin. This wasn't a family crisis. This was a transfer of ownership. The pattern stretched back further than I wanted to admit. I remembered the night my brother crashed my car at 17, and my parents made me lie to the police. Said I had been driving. Said we'd all suffer if he got in trouble. I took the blame. Got a record. He got grounded for a week and a new phone. And I told myself he was just a kid. That he'd grow out of it. But the truth was, it wasn't just him. It was all of them. A narcissistic family doesn't raise golden children by accident. They breed them through sacrifice. I returned to my computer, now searching with purpose. Custody laws. Abandonment statutes. Legal definitions. My heartbeat slowed as I read, understanding things I had only guessed at before. If you leave children with no clear plan of return, if you delegate care through deception, it can be considered neglect. Especially if the guardian wasn't consulted. Especially if the child's welfare is at risk. My name on that school form, without my consent, was more than a betrayal. It was a liability. But it was also leverage. I clicked open another email. From a year ago. My father writing about long-term solutions for Eric's parenting troubles. He's overwhelmed. Maybe we can rotate care with your aunt or someone else. Can you take a week here and there? It wasn't phrased as abandonment. It was disguised as teamwork. But it had been building, hadn't it? They'd been pushing the kids off like hot potatoes, trying to soften the fall. I just happened to be the last one who didn't say no loud enough. A photo of Eric sat on the shelf beside me, him and our parents, arms wrapped around each other at his graduation. I wasn't in the picture. I was at work that day. Covering a shift to help pay off the loan I took to pay my portion of Mom's medical bill. The one they later told everyone Eric had covered. I stared at that photo now with new eyes. Not as a sister. But as someone assembling evidence. The kids stirred in the other room. Their soft voices filtered down the hallway, sweet and uncertain. I walked toward them, paused in the doorway. They were sitting cross-legged on the bed, whispering over a storybook. They didn't look like burdens. They looked like survivors. Just like I had been. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilt for what I was about to do. I felt a strange, steady power. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't beg them to come back. I would document. I would expose. I would make sure no one forgot what they did. The pain would have its proof. And they would learn what it feels like when the good child decides to stop playing nice. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Eric. I just asked the right questions. And then, while waiting on hold with family services, I returned to the pink backpack. Dug deeper. In the very bottom, beneath a crumpled sweatshirt, was a sealed envelope with my name on it. My name, handwritten in my mother's script. I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside, a notarized temporary guardianship form. Signed. Filed. Dated. Weeks ago. No phone call. No warning. Just a legal erasure of their responsibility. And mine, written in ink I never agreed to. I sat back, heart stuttering. They had planned this. They'd planned everything. But they'd made one mistake, they left the paper in my house. And now it was evidence. And now, I was no longer their secret weapon. I was their enemy. The first call came just after breakfast. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the voice before it finished saying my name. My mother always led with that tight, clipped tone she reserved for cleaning up messes she'd caused. I'm just checking in. We didn't want to overwhelm you. Not, thank you. Not, we're sorry. Just that same underlying assumption, I would do what they needed. I would step into the flames without complaint. My silence on the line stretched long enough that she faltered. They were crying when we left. That was hard for us too. I didn't say what I was thinking, that leaving while children cried wasn't something that happened to them. It was something they did. I hung up. A minute later, another call. My father this time. His voice graveled with feigned concern, but the subtext was cold, efficient. You've always been the responsible one. The phrase was his favorite kind of manipulation, disguised as praise, meant to anchor me in place. What he really meant was, you'll do it, because we expect you to. I didn't answer him either. I just let the silence stretch again. It's remarkable how loud silence becomes when it's coming from the one person they thought would never use it as a weapon. The voicemails rolled in all morning. Not apologies. Not regret. Just pressure. My mother left one laced with passive guilt, we raised you better than this. It's not like you to ignore family. My father's follow-up was more direct, you're not helping by going dark. Eric is overwhelmed. These kids need you. Not him. You. It was always me. And that's when I knew for certain, they thought I would fold. That's what the whole plan had been built on. My predictability. My compliance. My silence. They thought I'd absorb the blow like I always had. Hide the truth. Protect the family name. Do the right thing, even when it cost me. Especially when it cost me. They were counting on it. Betting their entire escape plan on the idea that I'd rather suffer than disappoint. They didn't realize I'd stopped caring about disappointing people who felt no shame in abandoning children. I listened to the last voicemail, the one from Eric. His voice was slurred with whatever cocktail of guilt, ego, and drugs he was chasing now. You know I'm not cut out for this full-time parenting thing. They're better off with you anyway. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. That sentence, don't make this harder, rattled in my brain like broken glass. As if this burden wasn't already brutal. As if I was the problem for not absorbing it with a smile. I deleted the voicemail. Then I opened a notebook and began making lists. Names of attorneys. Family law specialists. Therapists. Caseworkers. Not friends. Not relatives. Not anyone who would ask me to be the bigger person. I didn't need comfort. I needed strategy. And I needed distance from the poisoned echo chamber of our bloodline. That afternoon, I met with a legal advisor at a community office downtown. I presented the notarized guardianship form, the timestamps, the recorded voicemails. She took her time reviewing everything, then looked up at me with a tight expression that said more than words. This isn't temporary. It's abandonment, she said. They created the illusion of consent, but it won't hold under scrutiny. Especially if you didn't sign anything. I didn't. They had forged a story around my silence, and for once, my silence would be their undoing. I returned home to more calls, more texts. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I sat beside the kids while they watched cartoons and slowly began documenting every single detail. Every phone call, every threat masked as a plea, every instance of emotional abuse they tried to weaponize against me. I pulled bank statements. I screenshotted the timeline of events. I cross-referenced every moment of contact. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about pattern recognition. Once you saw the machinery behind a narcissistic family, it was impossible to unsee it. They praised you when you obeyed. They punished you when you hesitated. They erased you when you resisted. That night, I tucked the kids in with calm words and steady hands. But inside me, something had shifted into precision. I no longer needed their permission to act. I no longer needed their approval to feel righteous. All I needed was one document. One carefully written email that would reroute the entire storm. I wrote it at midnight. Short. Formal. Laced with just enough legal language to signal that I wasn't flailing, I was preparing. I addressed it to my parents, with a CC to my attorney. The subject line was surgical, unlawful transfer of custody, notice of action. The body was clearer still. Effective immediately, all matters concerning the welfare of the minors left in my care without consent will be handled through legal representation. Any further communication outside counsel will be considered harassment. Evidence has been documented. Do not contact me directly again. I read it twice. Then a third time. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt like slicing the final thread. The one they used to pull me back into silence every time I got too close to truth. I hovered over the send button. My phone buzzed. Another text from Eric. You always thought you were better than the rest of us. You're not. You're just lonely. I stared at those words. Let them sit in the pile of memory. And then I smiled. Not with joy, but with the quiet calm of someone holding the blade now. I hit send. Then I turned off my phone. And I waited. Revenge doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it slips in through the silence, through perfectly phrased emails and strategically filed paperwork. That week, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't answer their calls. I didn't shout or confront. I simply got organized. While the kids built puzzles on the living room floor, I sat at the dining table with my laptop, a highlighter, and a stack of documents that had slept too long in drawers. I wasn't looking for closure, I was building a case. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes when you realize you were never loved unconditionally, only managed. My parents weren't careless, they were calculated. Their warmth had always been transactional. And now, with the kids dumped on my doorstep and no follow-up beyond manipulation, I saw the pattern too clearly to unsee it. I started with the notarized guardianship form. The date on it was 3 weeks prior to the day they dropped the children off. 3 weeks. Which meant they had prepared, consulted someone, maybe even paid a lawyer. They didn't just panic and make a mistake. They designed this. They set the trap slowly, counting on my history of silence. They had used my name without consent. I was done being their unpaid emotional labor. Next came the financial statements. I pulled up my own bank records and compared them to the timelines I'd kept, moments when I had helped out. The $3,000 I sent after Eric lost his job. The $800 for a medical emergency that was never explained. The credit card I let them use for groceries that racked up charges for hotels and spa visits instead. I went further, digging through the kids' medical receipts and school payments. Patterns emerged. Inconsistencies. The tuition bills marked paid by my mother's name, but funded from an account tied to mine. I'd been used as a shell. Quietly. Elegantly. I highlighted the anomalies in yellow. Then came the most damning trail, a forged signature on a co-signed loan Eric had defaulted on 2 years prior. I remember denying it when the collections agency called me, assuming it was a mistake. But the signature was there, at the bottom of the contract, my name, my handwriting, only, not quite. Slightly off. A mimic done just well enough to slip by unnoticed. They had stolen my name. That knowledge didn't sting the way I thought it would. It cooled me. I stared at the contract, at the betrayal disguised as routine paperwork, and felt something old and soft inside me wither away. The daughter they thought they still had was gone. In her place was someone sharper. Someone with documentation. I began scanning. Every piece of evidence went into a shared cloud drive labeled simply, case file. I uploaded recordings of the voicemails, screenshots of texts, the legal form from the pink backpack, even the school enrollment files with my forged emergency contact authorization. I didn't need to make a scene. I just needed to be undeniable. I consulted with a second attorney, this one focused on financial exploitation. Her voice was calm, clipped, impressed. "You've built a cleaner case than most professionals," she said. "Do you want criminal charges or just leverage?" I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because the question itself was power. They thought they had trapped me in care. Instead, they had walked into exposure. My reply was measured. "I want both." She nodded. "Then keep going. Find more. And don't warn them." So I did. I pulled their mortgage history. Traced an account that had me listed as an inactive co-owner, another forged file buried in fine print. I remembered the weekend they begged me to sign just some insurance forms, and now realized it was likely then. My memory of that day blurred with the way my mother smiled too wide and my father kept making small talk. How I didn't read the full document. How they probably counted on that. Fraud. Negligence. Abandonment. It wasn't just emotional abuse anymore. It was legal. And provable. The more I found, the less rage I felt. Anger was a fire. This was something colder, metallic, surgical. I was carving them out of my future with precision. Their photos still hung on the hallway wall, but now they felt like mugshots. The kids started calling me auntie with more comfort. They smiled easier. Slept longer. They didn't ask about their father, and I didn't mention him. I kept our days quiet. Normal. But every night, after they were in bed, I turned back into the archivist of my own erasure. That's how I found it, an old email from a family friend. Innocent at the time, just a quick note thanking me for taking care of the situation when Eric had that scare with CPS. I reread it twice. I hadn't known there was a CPS case. They never told me. I'd only watched the kids for a weekend, thinking it was just burnout. But that message, dated and backed up, suggested otherwise. They had used me as a shield. Again. And I had absorbed it unknowingly. I forwarded the email to my attorney. Then I filed a request for Eric's CPS records. I knew I wouldn't get everything, but I'd get enough. Enough to show that this wasn't the first time the children had been discarded. Just the boldest. 3 more calls came that evening. One from a blocked number. I let them ring. Then, at 9:04 p.m., my email pinged. Subject, confirmed investigation status. From, Division of Family and Child Services. Message, this message confirms that a case has been opened based on the submitted evidence. A representative will contact you within 48 hours for further statements. This case is now active. I leaned back in my chair. No explosions. No shouting. Just a single email that changed the entire balance of power. They still didn't know what I had done. And I planned to keep it that way, until it was far too late for them to run. It started with the voicemail that cracked something in my mother's voice. Not her words, their content was still wrapped in saccharine guilt, but the tone beneath. Trembling. Unsure. She was unraveling, and it came through even as she tried to hold the mask in place. We don't understand what's happening. All of this is being blown out of proportion. You're making things worse, sweetheart. That last word, sweetheart, was more reflex than sincerity. I could almost see her clutching her pearls, trying to rewind the clock, to summon back the obedient version of me she had always depended on. But that girl was gone, buried somewhere under the weight of notarized betrayal and years of weaponized love. I didn't respond. By then, the agency had already reached out. A woman named Dara, calm voice, clinical questions, a steadiness that made me feel seen in ways no one in my family ever had. She listened. Took notes. Didn't blink when I said the word abandonment. She didn't try to reframe it, didn't ask if maybe I was misunderstanding. She just asked for the dates, the files, the evidence. And I gave her everything. Folder by folder. Voicemail by voicemail. She asked if I feared retaliation. I said no. Because what could they do now? They'd already handed me the knife. By the end of our second call, she said, "I want you to know, we take this seriously." I'd been waiting my whole life to hear those words. The shift was subtle but seismic. I could feel it in the way their calls came more often, but with less conviction. My father's tone lost its authority, became clipped and erratic. He left long-winded messages filled with justifications. We thought we were doing what was best. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. We never expected this kind of reaction. As if the problem was my reaction, not their actions. My brother sent me a message filled with faux disbelief, as though he couldn't imagine why the state would be involved. "You've always been dramatic, but this is next level," he texted. I deleted it without blinking. The truth was now out of their control. What had once been family secrets whispered at dinner tables and buried under fake smiles had become documented, traceable, and impossible to unsee. The system had entered the conversation, and the system was listening. Dara called again on a Wednesday afternoon. Her voice had a new edge. "There are previous records, CPS involvement with your brother from 3 years ago. Neglect claims. Unsubstantiated due to lack of cooperation from witnesses. Your evidence changes that." I sat in stunned silence, though I shouldn't have been surprised. It made sense now, the frantic way they'd shipped the kids off that weekend years ago, the hushed phone calls, the odd visit from a family friend who just happened to be a caseworker. They'd buried it, like they buried everything. But now the grave was open, and what they'd hidden had a file number. The storm hit fast after that. Within 24 hours, the agency made contact with my parents. I didn't hear the conversation, but I didn't have to. I could feel the shift in the air. My father's next voicemail was almost breathless. "We need to talk. We're being accused of things that aren't true. You need to clarify this. You know how this will look if it goes on record. How it will look. Not what it is. Image over integrity, always." I didn't call back. That evening, I received an email from a family attorney I didn't recognize, copied in a message from my mother. "We'd like to resolve this amicably. Can we agree to mediation?" The desperation leaked through every word. They were trying to pull it back into the family circle, back into the place where shame kept people silent. But I had stepped out of that circle the day they drove away and left 2 crying children on my lawn. I forwarded the email to my lawyer without responding. I could feel them scrambling behind the curtain. I pictured my mother clutching her temple, muttering about reputation and what the neighbors would think. I imagined my father making calls, offering favors, trying to use the same connections that had always bailed them out. But this time, there were no favors. No family secrets safely contained. Only files. Facts. Dates. Actions. And consequences. I stayed quiet. While they scrambled, I made structure. Therapy appointments for the kids. Pediatric evaluations. School meetings. I learned what bedtime stories made them laugh, what snacks they preferred, what words made them flinch. I listened to them. And in doing so, I found more evidence, not legal, but emotional. Scars wrapped in stories. A time their dad forgot to pick them up from daycare. A dinner of dry cereal while he locked himself in the bedroom with loud music. My niece told me with a flatness that didn't match her age, sometimes we just stayed quiet so Daddy could think. I documented that too. The house became more than just shelter. It became testimony. Every wall, every photo, every routine I built was evidence of care. And in contrast, every absence from my parents became louder. They hadn't visited. Hadn't asked what the kids needed. Their concern began and ended with themselves. The final straw came in the form of an envelope in my mailbox, no return address, just my name scrawled in familiar script. Inside was a handwritten note from my mother. You've made your point. You've always needed attention. But dragging us into legal issues isn't the answer. This family is all we have. Don't ruin it just because you're hurt. Not an apology. Not an ounce of ownership. Just the same rewriting of truth, the same gaslighting dressed as concern. I folded the letter slowly, placed it into my file. Then I added it to the report. It was late that night, after I'd finished organizing the last set of school enrollment records, that I heard it, a knock at the door. Not frantic. Not casual. Deliberate. The kind of knock that lands in your chest. I moved slowly, heart thudding. The kids were asleep. The porch light buzzed above me as I approached. Through the window, I saw a figure, tall, plain clothes, clipboard in hand. Dara. Behind her, a second person. A uniform. I opened the door, breath held. She gave a small nod. It's time. He knocked like he owned the house. Like he'd forgotten the weight of what he'd done. 3 sharp raps, followed by silence. No texts first, no call. Just the knock, entitled and familiar. I didn't move right away. I stood in the hallway and listened, heart flat and steady, not from fear but from the knowledge that this moment had been coming since the second they drove away. The kids were at school. The house was quiet. There was no audience, no one for him to perform for. Just me. And everything I now knew. When I finally opened the door, he stood there with his hands in his hoodie pockets like a sulking teenager. Unshaven. Eyes bloodshot. That same slouch in his shoulders he always wore when he knew he'd pushed too far but still expected forgiveness. He didn't smile. Didn't speak. Just let out a deep sigh like I was already exhausting him. I leaned against the frame. You shouldn't be here. He shrugged. We need to talk. I didn't move to let him in. Let him feel the threshold. Let him understand this house was no longer his fallback plan. Talk. He scoffed, eyes darting past me like he expected to see his kids on the couch with juice boxes and cartoons. You're really going through with all this? CPS? Lawyers? Are you serious right now? I wasn't the one who dropped 2 children on someone's porch and drove off. He flinched at that, like he didn't expect the words to be so sharp. You knew I was struggling. Struggling doesn't justify abandonment. He stepped closer, lowering his voice into that syrupy tone he used whenever he needed something. Come on, it's me. I'm your brother. No. You're a liability, I said, cold. And a coward. That hit. I watched him stiffen, his eyes flickering. Rage rising just under his skin. I didn't have a choice, he snapped. I'd been drowning. I had no help, no one backing me up. Mom and Dad, he cut himself off too late. I straightened. Go on. Say it. He looked away, muttered, they said they'd handle it. I let the silence stretch until he had to meet my eyes again. So it was a plan. Not an emergency. Not a breakdown. Just a quiet little handoff. Like luggage. He opened his mouth to argue, but the guilt was already pooling on his face. He tried a different tactic. I thought you'd get it. You've always handled things better than me. You don't fall apart like I do. They said you'd understand. They were right about one thing, I said, stepping forward. I do understand. You all thought I was too weak to say no. You counted on it. But you're wrong. He shook his head, pacing now. I just needed time. I was gonna come back. I swear. No, you weren't. He stopped. What? I turned and walked to the table, picked up the file folder I'd prepared days ago. The one with everything inside. I dropped it on the table between us. 3 weeks before you left them here, your name was taken off their school emergency contact list. Mine was added. That wasn't last minute. That wasn't temporary. That was planned. You forged my name on medical forms. You took away my choice. And now you want pity because I didn't go along quietly? His face twisted into something raw. Don't act like you're innocent. You always had it together. The house. The job. The perfect life. You mean I wasn't enabled into failure? I snapped. You crashed and they padded your fall every time. They used me to keep your image intact. And I let them. Until now. His voice rose, brittle and defensive. This isn't about image. This is about family. You don't get to use that word, I said, low. Not after abandoning yours. He dropped into the nearest chair like the air had left his lungs. So what now? You want to ruin me? No. I want the truth to ruin you, I said. And I want you to know I'm not hiding it anymore. He stared at the folder, then at me. You really think they'll let you keep them? That was the moment he realized the tables had turned. His tone shifted again, this time to desperation. You don't know what it's like. Raising kids alone. You're not a parent. I became one the second you stopped being one. He sat still, trembling slightly. They'll hate me if you tell them. They'll survive the truth. They didn't survive your lies. His mouth opened, then closed. I saw it in his face, that flicker of understanding that he wasn't just losing control. He'd already lost it. He looked around the room like it would give him a foothold, some memory of childhood to grab onto. But there was nothing here for him now. Only consequences. I walked to the shelf and pulled down a small black device. Pressed play. His voice crackled through the speaker from our conversation just moments ago. They said they'd handle it. I just needed time. I thought you'd get it. He lunged forward. You recorded me? Yes. And I've recorded every voicemail. Every message. Every confession. You manipulative. No, I cut him off. Just precise. His hands balled into fists. You're destroying our family. You did that, I said, voice like steel. I'm just making sure no one pretends otherwise. He stood, breath ragged. You think you're better than me? You think taking them in makes you a saint? No, I said. But it makes me their protector. Something you never were. He stared at me for a long time. I didn't flinch. I didn't waver. Finally, his shoulders slumped. The fight in him drained out. He looked small. Pathetic. And for the first time I didn't feel guilt. I felt nothing. He turned to leave. But before he reached the door, I spoke again. They've opened an official case. Child welfare is involved. And now, so is fraud. He froze. I walked past him, opened the door. You should go. He stepped outside, stunned silent. I closed the door behind him. No slam. Just a click. And behind me, in the hallway, my phone buzzed. An email. From the agency. Subject line, custody hearing scheduled. The last time we had dinner together as a family, I was 18, freshly invisible, and sitting at the far end of the table while my brother recounted his latest success, something mediocre and celebrated like it was brilliance. My mother kept refilling his plate. My father beamed like he'd raised a prodigy. No one asked me how college was going. I remember wondering if anyone noticed I hadn't spoken in an hour. I left early that night. No one noticed that, either. Now, years later, they were all gathered again around my table, but this time, I wasn't the silent one in the corner. I had set every plate. Chosen every word. And I had invited an audience. They arrived dressed in their usual denial. My mother wore pearls and pretense. My father brought that rigid posture he used to use in boardrooms. Eric showed up late, of course, unshaven, eyes dark-rimmed, his tie an afterthought. They thought this was an attempt at reconciliation. A family dinner to talk things out, as my mother put it in the carefully worded group text I never replied to. I had said nothing because silence had become my scalpel. What none of them knew was that I had also invited 2 others. My lawyer, seated politely to my left, and Dara, the caseworker, whose calm gaze rarely blinked. They weren't there to argue. They were there to observe. Witnesses. Anchors. The mirrors I had waited my whole life to place in front of this family. The meal began an awkward cheer. My mother commented on the roast like this was a Sunday lunch in 2003. My father made a joke about politics, half watching Dara, trying to place her without asking. Eric shoveled food like he was starving, never looking directly at me. I watched them eat, watched them lie with their faces. I waited until dessert. That was when I pulled out the folder. A simple black file. My mother's smile froze. "What's that?" she asked, the edge already creeping in. "Truth," I said. And opened it. The first page was a printed screenshot of the guardianship form they'd left in the pink backpack. "This," I said, sliding it across to my father, "was signed and dated weeks before you dropped the kids at my door. Without my consent. Without even a conversation." My father's face hardened. "We discussed this." "No," I cut in. "You informed me. After the fact. That's not discussion. That's entrapment." My mother's hand twitched. "We assumed you'd be open to helping. And you assumed wrong." I pulled out the next piece, medical forms with my forged signature. Dara's eyes narrowed slightly. My lawyer remained still. "Forgery," I said quietly. "A federal crime." Eric shifted in his seat, but I didn't look at him yet. "I kept everything," I continued. "Every voicemail. Every message. Every threat disguised as concern. The agency has all of it. You didn't just abandon your grandchildren. You tried to frame it as generosity. You wanted to disappear, and make me explain it. We were desperate," my mother whispered. But the words landed hollow. "I don't care," I said, finally turning to Eric. "And neither will the judge." His eyes widened. "There's a judge?" "There's a hearing," Dara said calmly. "Custody, neglect, financial fraud. The evidence is substantial." Eric stood, fists clenched. "You set us up." "No," I said. "You set yourselves up the day you believed my silence was your shield." My mother looked stunned, like she couldn't believe this wasn't being smoothed over with apologies and tears. "What will people think?" she gasped. "Hopefully," I said, "they'll think twice before handing their children to liars and manipulators." The final piece I pulled was the email from the agency confirming the earlier CPS investigation, unsubstantiated only because I hadn't known the truth back then. "You endangered them," I said. "Repeatedly. And now you're being held accountable." My father stood, voice rising. "You're blowing this out of proportion. This is still family." "No," I said, rising too. "This is a crime scene with fine china." No one spoke after that. The room thickened with tension. The kind of silence that follows a detonation. It wasn't rage that held them, it was realization. That there was no fixing this. That they weren't in control anymore. That they weren't the heroes of the story. They were the villains exposed mid-monologue. Eric's face paled as he sank back into his chair. "You're really doing this?" "I already did." My lawyer collected the papers calmly, returning them to the folder. Dara stood, nodded politely. "We'll be in touch," she said. I opened the front door. One by one, they left. Stunned. Wordless. And when the door clicked shut behind them, the house exhaled. And so did I. There's a silence that follows survival. Not the kind that comes from shock, but the kind that arrives after the storm has passed and nothing is where you left it. The house was still. The dishes from the dinner remained in the sink, untouched. No one had spoken since. Not them. Not me. I hadn't expected apologies. I knew them better than that. But part of me, some long-starved fragment, had hoped for accountability. Instead, I got absence. They disappeared in the aftermath, not with shame, but with the practiced arrogance of people who believe they've been wronged simply because they were exposed. I didn't chase them. Instead, I swept the floor. I cleared the table. I opened windows and let their scent drift out of my home. It took days to feel the shift. Not in them, no, they would remain who they were, always, but in me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. Like someone who had finally stepped out of a burning house and realized the smoke clinging to her skin wasn't hers to carry. Eric didn't call again. I assumed he was too busy defending himself in meetings with social workers and legal counsel. The hearing date was set, the custody recommendation already leaning my way. The agency had seen the timeline, the documents, the recordings. It was enough. More than enough. But I kept collecting. Not because I needed more proof. Because I had learned how powerful it felt to be the one holding the truth. One morning, I went through the last few boxes in my closet, old photo albums, birthday cards, journals with pages soaked in a younger version of me. I read letters from my mother, filled with "we're so proud" and "you've always been so helpful." Not love. Praise. Measured only in relation to my usefulness. I didn't cry. I just packed the ones I needed to keep, the ones that reminded me of who I had been, and how far I'd come, and burned the rest in the fire pit in the backyard. Flames consumed their curated memories. I watched the smoke rise, not in anger, but in closure. What I kept were the facts. What I burned were the illusions. The kids noticed the change in the house before I did. My niece started sleeping through the night. My nephew began leaving his shoes near the door without being told. Their laughter didn't sound like defense anymore, it sounded like joy. And I realized, as I watched them curl on the couch in pajamas too big for their bodies but perfect for their new lives, that they were teaching me something about rebuilding. One night, after dinner, the boy looked up and asked, "Are we staying?" I didn't answer right away. I looked into his eyes, cautious, tired, waiting for the rug to be pulled again. So I knelt beside him and said, "You're not going anywhere unless you want to." He nodded. Not a smile, not quite relief. Just a quiet release. The first brick in trust. The family, my parents, Eric, didn't come back. Not physically. Not emotionally. They stayed distant, circling in the shadows of their own disgrace. My mother tried once, sent a carefully worded email weeks later. "I hope, in time, we can rebuild. Families go through hard things." I didn't reply. Some silences aren't punishment. They're protection. The lawyer called soon after. "We're finalizing the custody transfer," she said. "You're almost there." "Good," I replied. And meant it. There was no celebration. No champagne. Just a soft moment alone in the living room, watching the light fade through the curtains, thinking about how strange it is that peace doesn't arrive with a bang, but with a breath. I walked through the house that night, barefoot, touching the backs of chairs, smoothing the edges of this new life. My life. Theirs, too. I stood in the doorway of the guest room, their room now, and watched them sleep. Two bodies tangled in blankets, chests rising and falling in rhythm. Safe. Loved. Not perfect. But chosen. I chose them. No one forced me this time. That was the difference. Family isn't blood. It's behavior. And I had learned, slowly, painfully, that what we inherit doesn't have to define what we build. I went outside, sat on the porch with a cup of tea that had long gone cold, and stared up at the sky. The stars were too bright, like they were trying to say something. I thought about everything I had lost. Then I thought about what I had taken back. My voice. My autonomy. My name. They'd used it like a stamp, like a signature they assumed they could control. But now, it was mine again. Fully. Unapologetically. Later that week, the official envelope arrived. Custody, granted. Permanently. There were signatures at the bottom, mine, the judge's, the caseworker's. My brother's name was missing. He hadn't shown. My parents had sent a statement filled with polite disapproval and legal disclaimers. It didn't matter. They were no longer part of the story. I filed the document in a new drawer. Labeled it not just for legal reasons, but as a reminder, survival isn't enough. At some point, you have to live. I changed the locks on the house. Repainted the kitchen. Hung new photos, this time, ones we took ourselves. The three of us laughing at the park. Flour-dusted faces after baking disasters. Ordinary joy, captured without performance. There are still hard days. Nights when one of them cries out in sleep. Mornings when the shadows feel too long. But we move through them together. We build safety like bricks. And every day, I let go of a little more of what they left behind. What I kept were the lessons. What I burned was the lie that love requires silence. And then, one morning, as the kids got ready for school, my niece slipped a note into my hand. Crayon scrawled words across lined paper, "You're my favorite grown-up." I folded it gently. Put it in my pocket. That would be one I'd keep forever. Just as I zipped up their backpacks and opened the front door, my phone buzzed. A name I hadn't seen in weeks. My father. Calling. Again. I stared at it. Let it ring. Then I slid the phone into the drawer. And turned toward the sunlight. The final chapter lands not with fury, but with precision. No one screams. No one pleads. The power shifts quietly, like the tide pulling back and revealing everything they tried to bury. Their legacy, built on favoritism, manipulation, and control, crumbles under the weight of documented truth. I don't gloat. I don't chase apologies. I simply step out of the narrative they wrote for me and start writing my own. The revenge is legal, permanent, and deeply personal, custody granted, financial fraud exposed, emotional abuse archived and acknowledged. But the true victory isn't in the courtroom, it's in the mirror. I don't carry their shame anymore. I don't rescue people who set fires just to watch me burn. I protect the children they discarded, not out of obligation, but choice. I define family now, on my terms. That is the final twist. They lost control of me long before they realized it. And now, with the kids safe, the silence mine, and their calls unanswered, I offer no conclusion to them, only clarity to myself. They thought leaving those kids on my lawn would break me, but it only proved I was the one they should have feared all along. Where are you watching from?